I want to welcome you to the 11th lecture of our church history course. Today we're going to be covering the years 1800 to 1850. I've entitled this Baptist Splits and Breakoffs. But I want to let you know that there were splits before 1800. Baptist and split seems to go together. When Baptists began in England in the 1600s, there were actually two separate Baptist groups. There was the non-Calvinist group. They called themselves the General Baptists. And there was the Calvinist group that called themselves the Particular Baptists. And so by the time you get to 1660, there were 130 Particular Baptist churches in England and 115 General Baptist churches. Now these two would stay separate until you get to the middle 1800s, then they'd reunite. In America, we had a split during the Great Awakening. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the Great Awakening, this great revival that came to America. But what you had was that those along the East Coast, the established churches like First Baptist Charleston, for instance, did not like the emotions, and they considered it to be enthusiasm. That was their curse word in that day and time. They didn't like what they were seeing out in the western part of North Carolina, like Sandy Creek. And so there was a split occurred after the Great Awakening, because those who were for the Great Awakening called themselves Separatist Baptists, and those who were against the Great Awakening called themselves Regular Baptists. But fortunately, that split happened in the 1730s, 1740s. By the time you get to the Revolutionary War, Baptists realized we've got to be together through this trial that we're about to go through. And that brings us to the year 1800. Now, we had one incredible revival in American history called the Great Awakening, and that had changed America. It brought America back to the Lord. But there's another season of revival that we're going to look at today before we talk about these splits that began around 1800. It's oftentimes referred to as the Second Great Awakening, and it had two distinct phases. There was what happened as people were moved toward God on the east, and there was what happened as you went to the west, when you get over the Appalachians and over Alleghenies and get into Kentucky or places like that. So in the east, the Second Great Awakening probably dates back to Jonathan Edwards' grandson, Timothy Dwight. He became the president of Yale University, a university that was founded as a Christian university, founded to produce preachers, but by 1800, he could not find 8 professing Christians among the student body. And so what he did was he designated himself to be the chapel, made chapel mandatory, and then he made himself the chapel pastor. And so he began to do what we would call today apologetics. He presented the gospel and defended it and showed its reasonableness, and a revival broke out on Yale's campus. In Western New York, there was a lawyer who was dramatically converted named Charles Finney. In fact, the morning after he was converted, he went back into his law office, and somebody came to talk to him about one of the cases they'd hired him to see. He says, "I have a retainer from the Lord now." And without formal training, what he did was he began to preach the gospel. He preached it the way a lawyer would lay out his case. They said his eyes could pierce right through you. And he began in small towns in Western New York, but as the move went forward and people began to be brought to God, and towns began to be changed, he eventually had a great time of crusades or meetings in cities like Rochester, New York City, Philadelphia. And he did several innovations. He was the first one to go and find a large enclosed location. Remember, Whitefield preached out in the air. And so he would find either build a building or find a large building, and they would preach. The biggest innovation that he brought to Christianity was Charles Finney was the first person to give a public invitation. A lot of times folks think we've always had invitations. Not until the early 1800s. He was the first person to say, if you want to become a Christian, come forward. And so he was the one that brought that innovation into Christianity. So that's happening on the eastern part. But on the west, now let's talk about the west. Think about the people that were flooding over the Appalachians to go to this new land. A lot of them were people who wanted to be alone. They would say, if I can see another smokestack, it's time to move. And so they would go and they would start a farm, and they had to fight for their land. They had to build things from scratch. They were a rugged type of people, individualists. Well, how do you reach them when you're moving fast toward the west? Well, in 1801, a group of Baptist pastors, Methodist pastors, and Presbyterian pastors decided to do something to try to evangelize these people who have been moving west. They went to an area called Cane Ridge, Kentucky, and they advertised this for 2 weeks in July. Now, if you're in an agricultural place, July is probably the time you can take some time off. It's in between getting the crops ready and taking the crops in. So they advertised 2 weeks. They called it a camp meeting. And the reason they called it a camp meeting is because you had to camp. They just cleared a field, let people come in their wagons, set up their tents. And now, if you think about all these folk who live, if there is anything close to a town, it may be 50 people on the bend of a river. So 20,000 people came. Just meeting the social needs was incredible. But what they did was they had designated places, stumps and such, where you could go and hear preach. So you'd set your tent up, go around, talk to each other, have your campfire, and then just go from stump to stump and hear the preacher of your choice. If you wanted to hear the Baptist for a while, you'd hear him. You want to hear the Methodist for a while, you'd hear him. You want to hear the Presbyterian for a while, you'd hear him. And God began to move. Of the 20,000 people that met that first 2 week meeting, 3,000 were saved. Can you imagine what an incredible move of God that was? But it was emotional. Let me read to you the account of a man named Robert Semple who described what he saw there at Cane Ridge. It was not unusual to have a large proportion of the congregation prostrate on the floor. In some instances, they lost the use of limbs. No distinct articulation could be heard unless from those immediately by screams, groans, shouts, hosannas, notes of grief and joy, all at the same time. At first, many of the preachers disapproved of these exercises as being enthusiastic. The word enthusiastic back then meant fanatic and extravagant. Others fanned them as fire from heaven. Well, this was such a successful thing that not only did Cane Ridge decide we're coming back next year, but regional places, they began to have these 2 week meetings, these revivals. And folks, for the next 150 years, evangelical churches, especially in the South, and began to have as one of their main evangelistic tools to have an intensive week of evangelism that they called revivals. That became one of the most important tools for Baptists to win people to Jesus. Even after you got through trying to just cater to people in farm life, oftentimes the churches would still have their, quote, revival meetings in the middle of the summer because so many of the churches did not have indoor heated baptistries. Can you imagine that in the 1800s? Even today, I know of a lot of country churches where their baptistry is to go to the local creek or lake and they baptize. Well, folks, if you're going to be baptized outside in a creek or river, getting saved in July is the wisest time to get saved. And so that became one of our bedrock experiences. Well, as we're seeing God move again, once again, we begin to see some of these divisions. So I'm going to go through a whole lot of people who either left us or broke off from us or were parts of Baptist splits. The first split I want to talk to you about had, as one of the leaders of this particular group, was one of the men, the Presbyterian pastor who helped organize the Cane Ridge camp meeting. His name was Barton Stone. And even though he was a Presbyterian, he was just loose with that. He didn't really understand all the doctrinal things. He was just a good Westerner who wanted to see people saved. As he studied the Bible in 1803, he adopted baptism by immersion, and he led a group of former Presbyterians to follow him with the ideals of being Christians only. Meanwhile, at the same time, the Presbyterians in the East, Philadelphia, sent a missionary to the western part of Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh, that area was the Wild West in the early 1800s. And so they sent a roving Presbyterian missionary to take care of all these new communities that were coming up. Well, Thomas Campbell was that missionary. And as he came to towns, he would come to towns that had popped up. And the people would come to him and say, "You're the first preacher that's ever been here," or "We haven't had a preacher in town for 2 years." They would come up and say, "We've got babies that haven't been baptized. We haven't had communion either ever or in a couple of years. Could you lead us in that?" So he wrote back to his presbytery in Philadelphia and asked permission. And they said, "We want to remind you that you are Presbyterian. You baptize only Presbyterian babies. You give communion only to Presbyterians. Well, here in this new world, he saw that just as not relevant. So he made the bold move to resign his Presbyterian ordination. He said, I don't want to be a part of denominations. I just want to be a Christian. So he formed the Christian Association of Western Pennsylvania. It was a church that was put together. The only regret he had was his son Alexander. He had sent him to Scotland. Scotland is the home of the Presbyterians, to train to be a pastor. And he said, what's he going to think when he comes back and finds that I've left the Presbyterian church? Meanwhile, Alexander was in Scotland in the early 1800s, and they were splitting over and over again, arguing over petty things. So he got disgusted, got on a boat and said, I'm through with it. I just want to be a Christian. But what will my dad say when I come back to America? So they had a good reunion there in Western Pennsylvania, and they formed this church. They came up with a motto. They wanted to unite all Christians, to get rid of denominations. They wanted to unite all Christians. And their motto was, where the Bible speaks, we speak. Where the Bible is silent, we'll be silent. Now that sounds like that might work. The first crisis they had was in 1811 when young Alexander had his first child. They determined they wanted to be biblical, but they were Presbyterians. You normally baptize a baby. They said, now wait a minute. Let's go to the Bible before we baptize this baby and see what does it teach about baptism. And they became convinced that infant baptism was not in the Bible. They sought the only people in America who were baptizing believers at that time that they knew of, the Baptists. And so they had a local Baptist pastor baptize those two men. They went and baptized their church, and they joined the Redstone Baptist Association there in Pennsylvania. For the next 19 years, they were members of the Baptist denomination. But it was a shaky thing. Campbell and the two Campbells began to come with distinctions that we wouldn't agree with. Yes, we all practice believers' baptism by immersion, but they came to the conclusion that a person is not saved until the moment they go in the water. So they began to say it's baptismal regeneration. And they came up with some other things. They grew quite a bit. One of their evangelists was a man named Walter Scott, and he would go around doing a 5-finger method. I know our evangelism explosion is now doing that, but this is in the early 1800s. And he would say, hold up your hands. And then he would start off with your thumb, say faith, repentance, baptism, remission of sins, gift of the Holy Spirit. That's God's order. Are you ready to do it? And so that was how he would share the gospel. In 1830, after those 19 shaky years, the Campbells left the Baptist and took 10,000 of the Baptists with them. They were not popular with the Baptists that they left. Can you imagine if you have a denomination that at that time has a little over 100,000 people and 10,000 get taken away to this new movement? Now, not long after that, Barton Stone and the Campbells got together and said, let's combine our groups. And so they formed what was called then the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. By Alexander Campbell's death in 1866, there were now 200,000 members of this movement in America. They did later on have another split in 1906. There were a number of churches who petitioned their main movement to take our names off your list. They were no longer going to be called the disciples of Christ. They wanted to be called the churches of Christ. And they felt like the disciples of Christ had become liberal. So why is it that the Campbell's motto, where the Bible speaks, we speak, where the Bible is silent, we're silent, why didn't it work? Well, here's what you need to understand. One of the things they did was they said we have no creed but the Bible. So it is so Bible-centered. Because, folks, what happened is a lot of Campbell and his followers became dogmatic on very minor issues. I want to read to you something that's more current. This is a conversation I found on the internet. Here's a pastor who says, one day I received a call from a Church of Christ elder who wanted to have a Bible discussion regarding communion. This is two Church of Christ pastors talking to each other. As we met, he wrote 3 verses on a paper, Matthew 26, 1 Corinthians 11. After reading these verses, he concluded that bread and wine were part of the communion representing his body and blood giving for us. Well, no disagreement there. So I was curious as to why he got the third. He said, because Jesus said he took the cup, not the cups. And so basically, this Church of Christ pastor had determined that you had to use the common cup. And if you did like we do in our church, use the little Baptist shot glasses, then that's not real communion. You just got to be one cup. And so he asked him, does that mean that you believe if somebody uses more than one cup in communion that they're not Christians? He said, yes. So when you have people that become that defiantly picky on small issues, you can see how they would have a hard time getting along. Well, here are some of the unique beliefs of the churches of Christ dating back to Alexander Campbell's time. They rejected all creeds and confessions of faith. They said, we have no creed but the Bible. And the fact is, they believed that creeds like the Nicene Creed had done damage to the church. They rejected the Old Testament as being irrelevant to us today. So here's a very important point I'm going to make in just a minute. They started off saying, where the Bible speaks, we speak. But they narrowed it down saying, we're going to be New Testament Christians. So if you could not find a verse in the New Testament. They rejected anything not found explicitly stated in the New Testament. There were no mission boards, no instrumental music. So they say you can't find an instrument listed in the New Testament. Can I beg to disagree? In Colossians 3 and Ephesians 5, it says sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Sing psalms. So if you're going to sing the psalm, sing Psalm 150. It lists all kinds of instruments. So in essence, even though that psalm is not in the New Testament, we're commanded to sing psalms in church, and the psalms many times refer to instruments being used. And so they did this by an argument of silence. And then they also, in fact, they talked about, we're against innovations in the church. I remember one time watching a Church of Christ pastor on TV preaching against innovations in church. And he's in a church building. They just sung hymns that were written by folks in the last couple hundred years. And he was on TV, but he's saying, we don't believe in innovations in the church. So there you go. But their main thing was that they stressed that salvation doesn't occur until actual immersion. At the moment of immersion, you must call upon the name of the Lord Jesus. At that moment, that's when salvation occurs. And so they would not believe that anybody could go to heaven if they weren't your baptism as a Baptist would not count for salvation. Because we say you believe and then you're baptized. They say, no, at the moment of going under the water, you've got to be calling upon the Lord. I could spend time in the class. I would spend time on this particular issue and look at scriptures. But if I just remind you, the thief on the cross went to heaven without any baptism. And when they had this order, you get repentance, faith, baptism, gift of the Holy Spirit, bam, bam, bam. Can I remind you that in Acts 10 with Cornelius, that while Peter was preaching, the Holy Spirit fell on them. They were obviously saved, and then they went into the water. All right. Another group that was one of our breakoffs was a Baptist pastor named William Miller. Until the 1800s, most Protestants were postmillennialists. They believed that as we Christians would spread the gospel and people would get saved, we'd make the world better and better and better, and then Jesus would come. And so that was the theology of most. But William Miller was one of those who loved studying prophecy, and he believed that there would be a dramatic return, that the world, he just disagreed with that particular view. And so as he studied prophecy, specifically the book of Daniel, he became convinced from dating the Daniel prophecy to the time of the book of Daniel, and he counted every day is a year and all that kind of thing. He came up with the fact that Jesus Christ was going to return on the Day of Atonement of 1843. He wrote a book about this in 1838. He was going from church to church to try to preach to people. A Baptist going to Baptist churches to tell people to get ready. Another Baptist heard his arguments and became convinced he was right. And this man had a real gift at PR. His name was Joshua Hines. So he said, this is what we've got to do. We've got to have a magazine. And so they began to publish a monthly magazine based on his prophecy charts. But the other thing he did was, this is the first person I know of in church history to develop a prophecy chart. It was a chart that would be as big as the front of a church, and he would simply start his lectures and go from here and go there and go all the way through, and he had a prophecy chart. Well, his message got out and was so convincing that by October, the Day of Atonement, in 1843, 50,000 people sold everything they had, put on white, went to the top of the hill to welcome Jesus, and he didn't come. So William Miller said, what did I get wrong? He went back to his calculations and he says, missed it by 1 year. So he went back to preaching and said, no, it's next October. And that's when Jesus is coming back. So once again, he revved people up. You've got to understand there were far more than just the 50,000 that sold everything. This was a message that was catching on. 1 million people expressed some kind of interest in this prophecy teaching. But once again, October of 1844 came and went, and to his credit, William Miller said, I was wrong, and basically went into obscurity the rest of his life. But one of his followers was a woman named Ellen G. White. And she said to herself, I saw the arguments, I saw the dates, I saw the chart. It was right. Something must have happened. And she came up with some unique teaching. She said, well, actually, the second coming began then. Jesus moved from one chamber of the heavenly tabernacle to another to begin inspecting our works, called the introspective judgment of Christ. And she said the main reason why he didn't come back was because we have not obeyed the commands to worship on the Sabbath. She considered worshiping on Sunday the mark of the beast. If the church had been worshiping on the Sabbath, then Jesus would have felt that we were worthy to come back. She continued as a prophet to get more revelations. She had some strange dietary insights. Many Seventh-day Adventists today do not eat meat. They at least will not violate the Old Testament dietary laws. Now, if you think about this, and my church will understand what I'm about to say. How do you eat breakfast without bacon? That's a big dilemma. And so you're not allowed to break the Old Testament laws. And so one of her followers was a man named Kellogg. And he invented cereal so that Seventh-day Adventists would have something to eat. So they've developed some other peculiar beliefs. We've looked at them in the past. This is a history course, not a theology course, so I must press on. The next break-off that I want to talk about is a group of hyper-Calvinists broke away from the Baptists to form what has been called now the Primitive Baptist denomination. Now you've got to understand, by the time you get to 1848, Baptists have 100,000 members in the United States. We're a large denomination. We had started our official Baptist denomination in 1814 because as we looked in the lecture on missions, accidentally we got a missionary. Adoniram Judson had studied the Bible on the way as a congregationalist missionary to India. Oh, he found out he was a Baptist, so he sent Luther Rice back and said, tell the Baptists they now have a missionary. So we formed a denomination. We formed a foreign mission board, also sent others to go. We formed a home mission society as well, a foreign mission society, home mission society, so that we could try to reach America. We also in 1824 formed the Baptist General Tract Society, because we wanted to provide materials that could help win people to Christ and help educate our people. Well, in the 1850s, 1,600 Baptist churches sent word they no longer want to be a part of this particular denomination. They banded themselves into an association, and they used this term, of anti-missionary Baptists. They called themselves Primitive Baptists. Some of their folks who derided them in that day and time have called them hard-shell Baptists. Now, what was their beef? Well, one of the things that they resented was the fundraising, especially for home missions. You see, by this time, the church had gone west. Baptists had been able to continue to win people because the majority of Baptist preachers were men who got a call behind the plow as they were taking care of their farm. And they would go on the Sunday morning and preach whatever God would let them preach. So we had no formal training, anything like that. So we could go west with the people that went west. And so as people went west, God would call a preacher. With their own hands, they'd build their own building. They would take care of their needs. And all of a sudden, we're taking up a fund so we can send people out to help people get started and build buildings. They said, nobody helped us. So they didn't like that part. But they also did not believe that you should send anyone to missions, because they were, when I used the term hyper-Calvinists, I talked about in the missions lecture, they were John Gill Calvinists. The Calvinists to the extreme who believed that it would be sinful to share the gospel with someone who's not elect. The Primitive Baptists, even to this day, will not share the gospel with their own children, with their own friends. because if God intends to save me, he's going to save him. But I'm not going to thwart the eternal purpose of God by sharing the gospel with someone. And so they had this hardline Calvinism. But once again, like the churches of Christ, they said, we're not going to do anything we can't find in the New Testament. We don't find Sunday school in the New Testament. We don't find mission societies or publication boards in the New Testament. And they opposed training for pastors. But they also said the children need to be in the room when you're having church. Those were some of the things that they did. So they pulled out 1,600 Baptist churches pulling out in the 1850s to form that. Now we come, and I've got two more splits to talk about. The next one is slavery led to the beginning of the Southern Baptist Convention. I wish I could give you a more glowing picture of why the Southern Baptists came to be, but this is a dark chapter in our history. During the first half of the 1800s, our nation was divided over the issue of slavery. Long before the Civil War, tensions built between the North and South. In our country's history, both North and South were responsible for slavery. Let me explain why. The Northerners had the ships and the ports, and they would go and get the slaves and sell them to the Southerners. After the cotton gin was invented in 1792, the greatest cash crop for America was cotton. What oil is to Saudi Arabia, cotton was to the United States. That's the one thing that other countries wanted from us. And with the cotton gin, we needed people in the field, so slavery was necessary in order to pick the cotton. But in 1803, because slavery had been going on for quite some time, those up north said we no longer need to bring in new slaves. Biologically, they're producing enough. So they made it illegal to import any slaves. That no longer were there monetary benefits to slavery for the North, while it was still necessary in the South. Unfortunately, some of our most famous Southern Baptist pastors defended slavery. Richard Furman, for whom Furman University is named. I wonder when that name will be changed. But Richard Furman, for whom Furman University was changed, wrote a book defending slavery. Here were his three arguments to defend slavery. Number one, he said the Bible teaches slavery in the Old and New Testament. Now, I'd love to chase that rabbit. I'll just give you a little thought here. If you're talking about the slavery of the Old Testament, the slavery of American history, you're talking apples and oranges. If you go and read the passages in the Old Testament, you'll find that slavery in the Old Testament was much more like indentured servanthood. There was a 7-year deadline, and that person had to be free. It would be something somebody could do in order to get out of debt or to begin life, but it was not chattel slavery, where one human owns another human, can do whatever they want with him. There were laws in the Old Testament that would protect slaves from abuse. So it's apples and oranges. But the second thing he did, and this breaks my heart, he said Africans live in better conditions in the U.S. than they did in Africa. He had to be fooling himself. And then the third reason he defended slavery, he says, well, because of slavery, Africans now have the chance to hear the gospel and become Christians. So those were the three reasons he gave in defending slavery, and those three reasons were echoed in most Southern Baptist churches. How would we answer someone today who put forth those same arguments? I'll give you some thoughts. First of all, the Bible condemns all racial divisions, James 2:1, Galatians 3:28, even parables like the parable of the Good Samaritan. The Bible, number two, never taught the right for anyone to own someone like property. Number three, many of the inhumane practices of slavery contradict Bible commands. One of the most devastating things they could do is take a husband and wife and sell them off to two different people, break up a marriage. And so that had devastating effects. But also, when you say, well, the New Testament doesn't even confront slavery, it does in an incredible way. When you have the book of Philemon, where a runaway slave is told to return to his master, but he has a letter to give to his master. And this is what Paul says to his friend, who was the owner of Philemon, who was the runaway slave. He says, I want you to welcome him back, but not as a slave, but as a brother. I heard a professor one time when I was in seminary who said this: anytime you have slave and master calling each other brother, slavery will not last for much longer. So here's how the break occurred, because these tensions were growing. In 1844, Georgia Baptists, just to see what would happen, nominated a slaveholder to be a home missionary. The home missionary was in a dilemma because if they hired him, they would lose the support of the Northern Baptist. If they didn't hire them, they would lose the support of the Southern Baptist. So they just didn't make any motion on it. They just acted like that had never happened. They ignored this particular nomination. Now, we had something happen, though, that in Alabama, the Alabama Baptist churches asked the Foreign Mission Society for an official answer as to whether or not they would appoint a missionary who has a slaveholder, and our Foreign Mission Society for the national denomination unhesitatingly said no, they would not. So on May 8th, 1845, 2,983 Baptists met in Augusta, Georgia to form the Southern Baptist Convention. We were formed because we defended slavery. Now, the last of the Baptist near splits, this was one that we did avoid, but its impact is still out there. The convention was almost derailed in its infancy by something called the landmark controversy. Now, you remember how I told you that the Churches of Christ and Alexander Campbell took a whole lot of Baptists out, and there was bad blood between the two. Alexander Campbell was a debater. In his denomination, so many times a denomination will take on the personality of its founder, and so he loved to hold debates out in different towns, and so he would challenge Baptists to debate. Well, J.R. Graves became the head of the Nashville Baptist, the Tennessee Baptist paper in Nashville. And in his arguing, he would counter the Church of Christ arguments. The Churches of Christ would say we're the only true churches because we've recovered the way they did it. And then J.R. Graves says, no, Baptist churches are the only true churches. Everybody else is a social club. The Churches of Christ would put on their signs. You can still see it on occasion, established AD 33. You'll see that sometimes on a Church of Christ sign. So J.R. Graves said, we were established by John the Baptist in AD 30. Got you by 3. So he began to be our champion, but he had some views that were peculiar. He said there's no such thing as a universal church. There are only local churches in the New Testament. Now, obviously, he's not reading the same New Testament that I read. In Matthew, Jesus said in chapter 16, upon this rock I will build my church, singular, not churches. In Ephesians 1, it says he made Jesus the head of the church, singular. So, but the implication for that, this saying that there's only churches, not a universal church, is he's saying only churches can send a missionary out. You can't have a mission board. If somebody's going to be a missionary, they've got to come out of a local Baptist church. And so they're only churches. He also said that since Baptist churches are the only true churches, and when Jesus gave the ordinances, he gave them to the local churches. Oklahoma is still a landmark Baptist State Convention in its constitution. When I served there, I was fellowshipping with the other pastors. I was raised on this side of the Mississippi. I hadn't been exposed to this kind of thing. And so the old timers were sitting here saying that since Baptists are the only true churches, the only true baptism is when you get a Baptist. You have to be baptized by somebody who was baptized by a Baptist who's baptized all the way back to John the Baptist. And so they called it alien immersion if you've been baptized by anybody else but a Baptist. And you used to have those evangelism meetings with the Methodists, remember back in Cane Creek? Can't happen anymore because they're not true preachers. We're the only true preachers. They're not true churches. They're social clubs. So no fellowshipping between churches. And they said that communion can only be held by a local church. Their term closed communion meant closed only to that church. We do a Christmas Eve communion service, and we have people from other churches, other Baptist churches, that come to fellowship with us on that particular day because their church doesn't do it. Well, J.R. Graves had his way, we would have to say, don't you put your hands on our communion cups because this is for our local church. And so that's some of the things. Well, so you're following me here. No pulpit exchange because only Baptists are the preachers are true preachers. Only Baptist church, you got to be baptized by a Baptist, and that's the only true immersion. Well, if you take this to its logical conclusion, Jesus said in Matthew 16, the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. Well, if the only true churches are Baptist churches, therefore there had to have been Baptist churches all the way to the first century. So they came up with something that they call the trail of blood. And they say there have always been Baptists because if Baptists are the only true churches, there must have always been Baptists. And they went through church history, and anybody that was persecuted by the Catholic Church, they say, aha, that was a Baptist. So the Novatians, the Cathari were a group of people whose highest act of spirituality was a ritual suicide done to be united with Jesus. The Waldensians. Folks, if you study these people, none of those practiced believers' baptism. They all practiced infant baptism. They were just saying if they were persecuted by the Catholics, they must have been Baptists, and they make that prove their point. Well, these votes kept growing until we actually had a vote at the 1859 Southern Baptist Convention, and they were defeated. But even though they were officially defeated at a Baptist convention, their impact was felt for quite some time, especially this attitude that Baptists are the only true churches and that you should not have fellowship with others. That caused our Baptist denomination to become much more self-enclosed. I accepted Christ through Campus Crusade. I was trained with people who went to Dallas Seminary, Moody Bible Institute, people like that. So I knew a lot of the great names of Christian history. If I were to mention Harry Ironside or R.A. Torrey to the Baptist churches that I grew up, they would have not heard of them. They would only know W.A. Criswell or R.G. Lee. We were that self-enclosed. So our history is a history of breaking off. So here's your discussion question for this week. So turn it in by email to me. With its history of producing break-off groups, what groups do you anticipate seeing break off from Baptists in the near future? God bless you.